cowboy reined his horse to stop at the broken gate. Dust rose around the animal's hooves and settled on his boots. He sat in the saddle a long moment without moving. The porch sagged. The windows stared back like dead eyes. A folded paper crackled in his coat pocket, and he pressed his palm against it to be sure it was still there. He had ridden 7 years and 1,200 miles to sign that deed away. He swung down from the saddle and tied the reins to the rail. His spurs jangled across the warped boards of the porch. The front door hung open on one hinge. He stepped inside and stopped cold. Someone had swept the floor that morning. Who had swept the floor of an abandoned ranch in the middle of nowhere. Stay with me on this one. His name was Eli Hargrove, and the year was 1887, and the place was a quarter section of high prairie 30 miles north of Cheyenne in the Wyoming Territory. He had been born on that ranch. His father had broken the sod with a single ox and a borrowed plow, and had died in the second winter with frost in his beard, and a smile on his face because the cabin was finished, and the well was deep, and the boy was healthy. Eli had buried him under the cottonwood by the creek. He had been 9 years old that spring. His mother had outlived his father by 11 years, and then she too had gone, quiet in her own bed, and Eli had buried her beside the old man and put a flat river stone at her head because they had no money for a proper marker. He had been 20 when she died. He had been 22 when he married a woman named Sarah Jane Pickett from over in Laramie, a schoolteacher with brown hair and a laugh that sounded like a creek in spring. He had been 24 when the doctor came out from Cheyenne in a black coat and a black hat and told him Sarah was gone, and the child was gone, and there was nothing to be done. Eli had buried them both under the cottonwood that same week, and after the burial, he had walked into the cabin and looked at the cradle his own hands had built, and at the dress hanging on the peg by the door, and he had walked back out, and he had not stopped walking for 7 years. He had taken work on the long drives down through Texas and up through the Dakotas. He had slept on hard ground with the saddle for a pillow. He had ridden through blizzards and stampedes and river crossings where good men drowned. He had earned a name as a steady hand and a quiet one, and a man who did not drink and did not fight and did not speak unless spoken to. He had saved every dollar. Letters had followed him from town to town. Letters from a railroad agent named Mr. Cyrus Whitlock of the Union Pacific. Mr. Whitlock wanted to buy the ranch. Mr. Whitlock had a line surveyed across the high prairie, and the line ran straight through Eli's quarter section. Eli had ignored the first 6 letters. The 7th letter had come to him in a bunkhouse in Ogallala, with a date written in a careful clerk's hand. The 7th letter said the agent would be at the ranch at noon on the 15th of October with the papers and a fair price in greenbacks. Eli had read the letter twice. Then he had folded it into his coat pocket and saddled his horse and started riding north. He had ridden for 19 days. He had crossed the Platte at Julesburg and the Laramie at Fort Collins, and the country had grown wider and the sky had grown higher until at last he had crested the rise and looked down on the cottonwood and the creek and the cabin and the empty pole corral, and his heart had done a thing he did not expect. It had not broken. It had only sat there in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and useless, and he had ridden down the slope and through the broken gate to do what he had come to do. He stood inside the cabin door and he listened. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and sage, and something warm he could not name. He took a step. The floorboard creaked under his boot. He looked down. The board had been scrubbed. He could see the wet grain still dark where the lye soap had been. He lifted his head and looked at the hearth. There were ashes in the firebox, and the ashes were warm. He held his hand above them and felt the heat coming up. He turned slow on his heel. The table was set against the wall the way his mother had set it. A tin plate sat on the table with 3 biscuits on it, and a little crock covered with a square of clean cloth. He lifted the cloth. It was lard. Whoever had laid the table had been called away in a hurry. His throat was tight, and he did not know why. He walked to the bedroom door and pushed it open. The bed was made. The quilt his mother had pieced when he was a boy was folded back at the corner, the way Sarah had used to fold it. The dress on the peg was gone. He stood in the doorway and he stared at the empty peg, and he could not breathe. Then he heard the sound. A small sound. A scuff above his head. The loft ladder leaned against the wall by the back door. He went very still. He drew his pistol from the holster on his hip. He did not cock it. He walked across the cabin without making a sound, because a man who has slept beside 10,000 cattle learns to walk without making a sound. He reached the foot of the ladder. He looked up. The loft opening was a square of black. He took one rung and then another. He came to the top, and he laid his free hand flat on the loft floor and he listened. He heard a breath. A small, frightened breath, the breath of something that did not want to be found. Believe me, he had heard that breath before, in barns and arroyos on the long drives, the breath of a hurt thing trying to be quiet. He raised his head slowly above the loft floor. His eyes adjusted in the dim. He saw the hay piled against the back wall. He saw the broken bridle and the rusted hand plow and the old McClellan saddle from the war. And then he saw the eyes. Two pair of eyes. One pair small and low, and one pair larger and higher. Two pair of eyes, watching him, neither blinking. Now here's the thing. One of those pair of eyes was the same color as his own. He held very still on the ladder. He did not raise the pistol. He let his eyes adjust until he could see them whole. A woman, thin, very thin, in a brown calico dress that had been mended and mended again. Her hair was the color of dry wheat and tied back with a piece of leather lace. Her cheekbones stood out sharp the way they do on a body that has not eaten well in a long time. She was sitting on the loft floor with her back against the wall and her arms wrapped around a boy. The boy was small. 6 years old, maybe 7. His hair was the color of pale corn silk. He was wearing a man's shirt that came down past his knees. He was holding a wooden horse carved from a piece of pine. His eyes were pale blue. They were the same pale blue as Eli's own eyes, and as Eli's father's eyes, and as Eli's grandfather's eyes, who had come over from Norway in the year of our Lord 1841. Eli's grandfather's eyes looking back at him from a boy he had never seen before. He climbed the last rung, and he stepped onto the loft floor. He holstered the pistol slow so the woman could see him do it. He held his empty hands out at his sides. The woman did not move. The boy did not move. Eli crouched down so he was on their level. He took off his hat. His hair was the same pale color as the boy's, shot through now with gray. The woman saw it. Her eyes went from his hair to his face, and her mouth opened a little and a sound came out of her, half a word, and then she closed it. Eli cleared his throat. He had not spoken to a woman in 7 years, and his voice came out rough. He said, "Ma'am, I don't mean you no harm." The woman did not answer. Eli reached slow into his coat pocket and pulled out a strip of jerky he had been saving for his supper. He laid it on the floor between them. Eli said, "You can have it. I got more in my saddlebag." Then he said the thing that had been climbing up his throat. He said, "Ma'am, what's the boy's name?" The woman was silent for a long time. Then she said one word. She said, "Caleb." Eli sat back on his heels. Caleb had been his father's name. Caleb Hargrove, buried under the cottonwood by the creek. He looked at the boy a long time. Then he said, "Ma'am, who are you?" And the woman's eyes filled up with water that did not fall, and she said, "My name is Hannah Pickett." And Eli's heart did the thing again, only this time the stone in his chest cracked clean down the middle, and he felt the crack go all the way to the bone. Pickett, his Sarah's maiden name. Pickett from Laramie. Outside, far off, very faint, he could hear the sound of wagon wheels on the road from town. The wagon was a long way off, but it was coming. A deep quiet settled over the loft, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm breaks. He stood up slow. His knees popped. The boy flinched at the sound, and the woman pulled the boy closer against her side. Eli held up his hand again. "Easy," he said. "Easy." He listened to the wagon. 2 horses. A buggy, not a freight rig. Light wheels. Coming up the south road from Cheyenne. He pulled the watch from his vest pocket and snapped it open. 5 minutes to noon. Mr. Whitlock was punctual. Eli closed the watch and put it back. He looked at the woman. He said, "That buggy is the railroad. That buggy is here to buy this place from me." The woman's face did not change, but her arms tightened around the boy. Eli said, "You stay up here. You stay quiet. You don't come down until I call you. Do you understand me, ma'am?" The woman nodded once. Eli looked at the boy. He said, "Son, you mind your mama." The boy nodded too, a small careful nod, and his pale blue eyes did not leave Eli's face. Eli picked up his hat. He put it on his head. He went back down the ladder slow and quiet the way he had come up. At the bottom he stood for a moment in the cabin, and he looked around it. He looked at the swept floor, and the laid table, and the warm ashes, and the folded quilt. He looked at the empty peg where the dress had been. Then he walked out onto the porch, and he closed the door behind him soft, and he leaned against the porch post, and he waited. The buggy came up the road and turned in through the broken gate. 2 men in black coats and stiff black hats. The driver was a young clerk with a thin neck and round eyeglasses. The passenger was Mr. Cyrus Whitlock of the Union Pacific Railroad, and he was a heavy man with side whiskers like gray wire and eyes the color of wet slate. He climbed down from the buggy with a leather case in his hand, and he smiled the way men smile when they are about to win something. "Mr. Hargrove," he said. "Mr. Hargrove, you are a hard man to find." Eli touched the brim of his hat, but did not take it off. Mr. Whitlock walked up to the porch. He said, "I trust your ride was uneventful." He said, "I have the papers here." He said, "I have the price agreed in greenbacks, $600, more than fair for 40 acres of dry prairie." He said, "If you will sign here, and here, and here, we can have the matter concluded inside of 10 minutes, and you can be on your way a wealthier man than you came." He set the case down on the porch rail and snapped it open. The papers were inside, crisp and white, with a fountain pen lying on top of them. Eli looked at the papers. He looked at Mr. Whitlock. He looked past Mr. Whitlock at the buggy and at the clerk and at the dust hanging in the air behind the wheels. Then he looked at the cabin door behind him, and he thought about the warm ashes and the laid table and the boy with his grandfather's eyes. Mr. Whitlock cleared his throat. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "the pen is right here." Eli reached very slow into his coat pocket. He took out the deed. The deed was folded into quarters, and the paper was soft from being carried for so many miles. He unfolded it. He looked at it. The land office stamp from 1859. His father's signature in faded brown ink. His own name added below it in the careful hand of a Cheyenne clerk in 1879. Eli closed his hand around the deed. He closed it tight. He felt the paper crumple in his fist. He stepped off the porch. Mr. Whitlock's smile froze a little. "Mr. Hargrove," he said. Eli walked past him to the buggy. He stopped beside the wheel. He turned. He said, "The ranch is no longer for sale." Mr. Whitlock blinked. He said, "I beg your pardon." Eli said, "The ranch is no longer for sale, Mr. Whitlock. You can take your buggy and your clerk and your $600 back to Cheyenne, and you can tell whoever sent you that the Hargrove place is staying with the Hargroves." Mr. Whitlock's face went the color of old beef. He said, "Mr. Hargrove, you do not understand." He said, "You have ridden a long way for nothing if you intend to play games with me today." He said, "The line is surveyed. The line will be built. The line runs through this land, and the railroad will take this land one way or another, with your signature or without it." Eli looked at him a long moment. Then he said, "You go ahead and try, Mr. Whitlock. You go ahead and try." And he opened his fist and dropped the crushed deed onto the dirt at his own feet. And the wind came up just then off the high prairie, and it lifted the deed and rolled it across the yard like a tumbleweed. And Eli did not chase it, and Mr. Whitlock did not chase it, and the deed rolled to a stop against the foot of the porch step where Sarah Pickett's worn-out shoe had stood for 3 good years before the doctor came in his black coat. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. Mr. Whitlock did not move for a long second. His clerk sat in the buggy with his mouth a little open. A meadowlark called from somewhere down by the creek. Eli walked back to the porch and he picked up the deed and he brushed the dust off it, and he folded it again into quarters and put it back in his coat pocket, where it had ridden for 19 days. Mr. Whitlock found his tongue. He said, "Mr. Hargrove, this is a serious matter." He said, "The Union Pacific will not be put off by a cowboy's sentiment." He said, "There are courts in this territory, and those judges look favorably on progress." Eli stepped back up onto the porch. He turned and faced the railroad man. He said, "Mr. Whitlock, do you see the cottonwood down by the creek?" Mr. Whitlock looked. He said, "I see it." Eli said, "There are 3 graves under that cottonwood." He said, "My father is in one. My mother is in the second. My wife is in the third." He said, "My wife was buried in '80 in a pine box I built with my own hands, and a baby was buried with her that the doctor said was dead." Mr. Whitlock said nothing. Eli said, "You tell the judges that, Mr. Whitlock. You see how they like the sound of that in a Cheyenne courtroom." Mr. Whitlock's gray eyes narrowed. He said, "Mr. Hargrove, I will give you 48 hours. He said, "I will come back on Friday at noon with a higher offer." Eli said, "Do not waste the trip." Mr. Whitlock picked up the leather case from the porch rail. He snapped it closed. He climbed into the buggy. The clerk turned the horses. The buggy rolled out through the broken gate and down the south road toward Cheyenne. When the buggy was a speck on the horizon, Eli opened the cabin door. He stood inside and he called up to the loft. He said, "Ma'am, you can come down now." There was a long silence. Then he heard the soft scuff of bare feet on wood. The woman came down the ladder first. She moved slow because she was weak. Her wrists were too thin, and her collarbone stood out under the calico. The boy came down after her, one rung at a time, and when he reached the bottom he stood close against her skirt and he kept his pale blue eyes on Eli. Eli pulled a chair out from the table. He said, "Ma'am, please sit." The woman looked at the chair and then at the table where the 3 biscuits sat under the cloth. She said, "That is your food." Eli said, "No, ma'am. That is your food. I expect you laid the table this morning." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then it is your food. Please sit." She sat. The boy stood against her knee. Eli went to his saddlebag by the door. He took out the small leather pouch of coffee beans and the side of bacon wrapped in oilcloth and the bag of cornmeal he had carried from Ogallala. He laid these things on the table. The woman put one hand over her mouth and her shoulders began to shake, and she did not make a sound. The boy watched her, and his lower lip trembled, but he did not cry because he had learned in some hard school not to cry. Eli sat down across from her. He took off his hat and set it on the table. He said, "Ma'am, I think you had better tell me how you came to be in my loft." The woman lowered her hand. She drew a long breath. She said, "Sir, I am Sarah Jane's younger sister. My name is Hannah. I came because there was a letter." Eli said, "What letter?" She said, "Sir, there was a letter from the doctor in Cheyenne. The letter was sent to our father a month after the burial, and it said the doctor had made an error, and that the child had been living when he left the cabin, and that a woman from the Shoshone had taken the baby in. Our father rode out to find the baby. He found him with the Shoshone woman, and he paid her, and he brought the child home to Laramie, and we raised him. Sir, this is your son. This is your Caleb." Eli sat very still. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him. The boy's pale blue eyes did not waver. "Caleb," Hannah said, "our father is dead now. He died in March. The boy's grandmother died last winter. The bank in Laramie took the house in May. I had no place to go and no money, and only the boy." Eli said, "Why did you come here?" Hannah said, "Sir, the boy was born here." His father owned this ranch. I read your name in the courthouse book. I thought if we could come and live quiet, if we could wait." She did not finish. Eli said, "Wait for what?" Hannah did not answer for a long moment. Then she said, "Wait for you, sir. Wait for you to come home." He stood up from the table. He could not sit. He walked to the door and he opened it and he stepped out onto the porch and he stood with his hands on the rail and he looked at the cottonwood down by the creek. He looked at it a long time. The leaves were starting to turn copper at the edges and a few were drifting down into the creek and floating away on the slow water. This is where it turns. His Sarah was not under that tree. His Sarah was under that tree. The baby was not buried with her. The baby was inside the cabin, holding a carved wooden horse. The doctor had been wrong. The doctor had been wrong for 7 years. Eli closed his eyes. He saw Sarah's face the way it had been on the morning she went into labor, flushed and laughing, and a little scared, her brown hair coming loose from its pins. He saw her face the way it had been 3 days later when he laid her into the pine box, gray and waxen and gone. The baby had been wrapped in the blanket beside her. The doctor had said it was kinder that way. Eli had not opened the blanket. He had not looked. He had nailed the lid down, and he had carried the box out to the cottonwood himself, and he had dug the hole himself, and he had lowered the box himself, and he had not asked any questions because the doctor had been a learned man in a black coat with letters after his name, and Eli had been 24 years old and broken in half. He opened his eyes. The dust had settled in the yard. Eli stood on the porch, and he made a list in his head, the way a man does who has slept beside 10,000 cattle. The woman and the boy needed food cooked tonight. The boy needed shoes because he had come down the ladder barefoot. The roof on the barn had a sag in it that would not hold a winter. The pole corral was down on the north side. There was no firewood split in the woodshed, and a Wyoming winter would be coming inside of 6 weeks. There was a railroad man coming back on Friday at noon with a higher offer and a threat behind the offer. There was a 6-year-old boy inside the cabin who had his eyes. There was a woman who had walked all the way from Laramie with that boy and had kept him alive on Lord knew what, and had swept the floor of an empty cabin every morning waiting for a stranger to come home. Eli put his hand on his pocket and he felt the deed there. He felt the soft, worn paper of it. He felt the weight of it. He felt the 7 years of it, and the 3 graves under the cottonwood, and the warm ashes in the firebox, and the boy's pale blue eyes. Then he turned and he opened the door and he went back inside the cabin and he said, "Ma'am, can you cook biscuits if I split the wood?" And Hannah Pickett raised her face from the table and she said, "Sir, I can cook biscuits." And Eli said, "Then we will eat." And he picked up the axe from beside the door, and he went out to the woodshed, and he split kindling until his shoulders ached, and the sun went down behind the rise, and the cabin window glowed warm and yellow against the blue of the prairie dusk. And when he came back in with his arms full of split pine, the table was set for 3, and the boy was kneeling on a chair with his nose almost in the lard crock, and the smell of biscuits was coming up out of the iron stove. And Eli Hargrove stood in the doorway with the wood in his arms, and he thought, so this is what a man comes home to when he comes home at last. Mr. Whitlock did come back on Friday. He came with a buggy and a clerk and a deputy sheriff from Cheyenne in a tin star and a black mustache. The deputy stayed in the buggy with his hand resting easy on the butt of his revolver, and Mr. Whitlock walked up to the porch with a thicker leather case than the one he had carried before. He set it on the porch rail. He opened it. He said, "Mr. Hargrove, $800. He said, "That is more than this land is worth, and you know it." He said, "Take the money." He said, "The deputy is here to witness the signature and to keep the peace." Eli stood on the porch in a clean shirt with his hat on his head, and he looked at the $800 and he looked at Mr. Whitlock and he said, "Mr. Whitlock, I told you on Tuesday and I am telling you on Friday. The ranch is not for sale." Mr. Whitlock's face darkened. He said, "Mr. Hargrove, the railroad has options." He said, "The railroad can apply to the territorial court for an order of eminent domain." He said, "You will lose the land and you will lose it for whatever price the court sets, which I assure you will be less than I am offering today." Eli said, "Then go to the court, Mr. Whitlock." Mr. Whitlock said, "Do not be a fool." Eli said, "My son was born under this roof. My wife is buried under that tree. My father broke this sod with one ox. I will not be the Hargrove that loses it." Mr. Whitlock looked past Eli at the cabin door. He had not known about a son. His face changed when he heard the word. He looked at the door a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Hargrove, may I speak frankly?" Eli said, "You may." Mr. Whitlock said, "The survey is set." He said, "But the line can be altered if there is a reason." He said, "The line can swing 2 miles north and avoid this quarter section." He said, "The cost to the company of such an alteration is not small, but it is not impossible." He said, "I would need to make a case to the directors in Omaha." He said, "I would need a reason." Eli said, "I have a son in that cabin who has my eyes." He said, "That is a reason." Mr. Whitlock looked at Eli a long time. Then he closed the leather case. He said, "I will write to Omaha tonight." He said, "I will tell them the man up at Section 12 has a 6-year-old boy and a buried wife and 3 generations in the ground, and that he is not going to sell." He said, "I will recommend the northern alteration." He said, "I cannot promise the directors will agree." Eli said, "I understand." Mr. Whitlock touched the brim of his hat. He said, "Mr. Hargrove, I have been a railroad man for 22 years, and I have bought ranches from 1,000 men, and not one of them ever said no to me twice." He said, "You are the first." Eli said nothing. Mr. Whitlock said, "I hope your boy grows up tall on this land." Then he turned and he walked back to the buggy. The deputy took his hand off the revolver. The clerk turned the horses. The buggy rolled out through the broken gate that Eli was going to fix tomorrow and down the south road toward Cheyenne, and the dust hung in the air for a long time, and Eli stood on the porch and watched it settle. And when it had settled all the way, he went inside the cabin where Hannah Pickett was teaching Caleb the names of the letters with a stub of pencil on a piece of butcher paper, and the boy looked up when his father came in. And Eli Hargrove crossed the room, and he laid his hand on the back of his son's small neck. Careful and easy the way a man lays a hand on something he has been waiting his whole life to hold, and the boy did not flinch this time. And outside the wind moved across the high Wyoming prairie, and the cottonwood by the creek let go 3 more copper leaves into the slow water. And the railroad ran 2 miles north of Section 12 from the spring of 1888 until the day they tore the tracks up in 1941. And the Hargrove place stayed in the family for 4 generations. And the deed Eli Hargrove had crushed in his fist on the 15th of October in 1887 is still folded in a glass case in the parlor of the cabin to this day.